I'm not sure what reading you're going to hear today. I'm going to follow along the continuity, which is what the liturgy calls us to do. But there are special readings here in the United States because this is also the day of prayer. Let me come up with the exact name here. A day of prayer for the legal protection of unborn children. It's also the feast of St. Vincent, Deacon and Martyr. But so that's the day today. And the readings for the day of prayer for the legal protection of unborn children are different. There's actually a whole bunch of readings of which you can choose one Old Testament, one New Testament, and one Gospel. However, I'm going to follow with the continuity, which is always considered the preference in the liturgy. In that case, the day is also the Thursday of the second week in Ordinary Time. Now, obviously, this is an important day here in the Commonwealth. In the United States of America. I was going to say Commonwealth of Massachusetts, but it's throughout the entire country. And one of the things that was taught, it came out in, I believe it was 1972, the ruling from the Supreme Court, which said that there was legal protection for abortion up to, I think, the first or second trimester, right up until the Dobbs decision. And that's what the Supreme Court came out and decided back. This was during the Nixon administration. And many people look at the Nixon administration, which had appointed a couple of the justices, if I'm not wrong, and still they came out and legalized abortion. And in that sense, they felt that they had betrayed Nixon. But that's a story for another time. So then what happened was the Dobbs decision came out. Now, what is the Dobbs decision? The Dobbs decision, it really returns the question back to the states, which many people believe was the original, was more constitutional. Because if you know anything about the United States, for those of you who are listening from outside the United States, there is a tension in this country between, and it's going on right now, as a matter of fact, between the authority of the states and the authority of the federal government. So this country was originally set up with an intense amount of independence of the states and an intense amount of authority of the federal government. And eventually it was decided that ultimately the federal government, federal laws would apply, federal authorities would apply. And so we actually had a civil war over that because the whole issue was the understanding of slavery, which was allowed in certain states and it wasn't allowed in other states, and the federal government was working to eliminate slavery throughout the country. And ultimately the southern states came up and said, no, we believe in states' rights, and if we want to have slavery, we want to have slavery. And so it was a fight over slavery and states' rights. Well, now we're going through the same thing again as far as the legal aspect, not obviously with slavery, but with the aspect of the authority of the federal government in response to the immigration issue. So the federal government says that people who are here illegally, they've changed their tune a couple times. Originally, remember, the campaign promise was anyone who was here illegally would be removed. And people were warned that this would be a problem because there are many people who are here, as they're using the term illegally. I use the term undocumented, which really angers a bunch of people, but that's okay. Who are not doing anything wrong except for the fact they're living here illegally. And people will say, well, that's a crime in itself. Well, not according to Rudy Giuliani, who in his description many years ago, because remember, he was also the district attorney in New York, he said that this was a civil infraction, not a criminal infraction. He always said that. So anyway, what's happening is you have ICE that's come in, and originally what they said is they were going to remove people who were here, as they use the term, illegally. But now what they're saying was, no, we're going after those people who are, I think, either accused or convicted of very serious crimes and who are here illegally. That's different from what the campaign promise was. The campaign promise was everyone out who is here illegally. So they're changing their tune a bit, and people warned at that time, wait a minute, there are certain people, as I used to say, the babushkas up in the attic. And what that means is babushka is the Russian word for grandmother. It's similar. It's an Americanized version of it. And what that means is the grandmother who's here, who may or may not have documents, who lives in the attic. I've met a few of them over my 32 years of priesthood, who may live up in the attic, who lives a fine life, doesn't speak a single word of English, and the family takes care of them. That's the babushkas who live up in the attic, of all different cultures and everything else. And that's one of the things people warned. There are people here who are, and John McCain was one of them, who are here illegally, who are minding their own business, who are doing work, they're paying taxes, they're not benefiting from it. And what are you going to do about them? And people on both sides of the issue brought that up. You know, among them was Dan Bongino, before he became assistant director of the FBI, brought up the issue. Well, we know there are people that are working in restaurants and they're working different places, and they may not have documents, but they're doing the work, and they're not necessarily taking people's jobs because there isn't anyone to do those jobs, and there is those issues too. So this all goes back to the issue with states' rights and the federal government's rights. And so one of the major issues that came out on was, of course, in regards to abortion. The Dobbs decision said, no, we're going to support states' rights, and states make the decision whether or not abortion will be legal. So what has happened is, in certain countries, mostly certain states rather, mostly in your blue states, abortion is very much protected, and in other states, mostly in your red states, abortion is not protected. And then you have the issue of Texas, which has some very serious laws that were passed right after the Dobbs decision. The question is, of course, if you don't know my political affiliation, it's that I am a Christian anarchist, as was Dorothy Day. So what it is, what do I believe? I believe if people lived the gospel, there would be no need for law, which obviously you'll turn around and say, well, people aren't living the gospel, therefore we have need for law. Okay, yeah, you're right. You're absolutely right. But the more people live the gospel, the less there is a need for law. And that was the way Dorothy Day looked at it. That's the way a lot of people looked at it. And that's the way Thomas Paine looked at it, although he wasn't necessarily a Christian. But he understood that if people really lived in service to one another, you wouldn't really have the need of law. So as you understand, we have this thing go back and forth. And my whole thing is to really teach a way of living the faith that abortion would not be necessary, and therefore laws for or against would not be necessary. That's where I come from. And that's why I get so upset of the bishop in the American Southwest in Texas, of all places, who goes to Congress, who complains on X to Congress that they need to make a law for gun control. And I'm like, wait a minute, you are literally in the business, I've said this before, of teaching people how not to use guns to kill people, and yet you're going to Congress and telling them we need to have laws to teach for people that have guns not to kill people, where we've got to preach the gospel more. That's where I'm coming from. So this is the day that really is talking about originally the Roe versus Wade decision, which was a major win for federal rights. I'm not talking about a win for abortion. Obviously, I'm not talking that because that isn't a win, but it's a major win for federal authority. And the Dobbs decision was a major win for states' authority. Those two elements, which have always been at war in this country, are mega at war, mega, M-E-G-A, at war here in this country, and especially in Minnesota. So there's all kinds of issues that go, and it really goes back to this major issue in our Constitution between states' rights and federal rights. And what you have there is the people who are looking for the power of the federal government are called the Federalists. And they understood that if we were just a confederation of states without a federal government on top of it, then what you have is that there are certain things the federal government has to handle, mostly in light of taking care of the people and running the government, that the states as a collective cannot do. Collective isn't the right word, I guess, especially in these days, but as a confederacy cannot do. And this is the issue that is always a struggle in our country, and this is what's blowing up our country right now, that whole issue between states' rights and federal government rights. So here is the day we're praying for people to understand that the unborn need legal protection. That we remember there were people, especially those who are pro-abortion. Always remember this. When you are talking about any form of destruction of a human being or imprisoning, enslaving a human being, it always begins with dehumanizing the person. Always, always, always. One of the reasons for slavery was saying they weren't the black community wasn't really human. That's wrong. That's false. And we as Catholics can't believe that. One of the reasons for any form of genocide, what was it the Nazis did? Jews aren't human. They're all these evil people is what the Nazis would say. Obviously, that's false. And again, you Catholic can't believe that. So the abortion issue begins with saying that an unborn child is just a clump of tissue. And I've interviewed people who've literally said that to me. An unborn child is just a clump of tissue. There was a magazine, I forget, maybe it was, well, I'm not sure what it was, and they decided to ask people, about different, like, animals' rights, and they asked all these questions to so-called pro-life people, and they got all the answers. Well, I said, well, if you're going to ask those questions and be unfair, why don't we ask that question to the abortion rights people? And so I did, and they would always say the fetus is nothing more than a bunch of lifeless tissue, lifeless cells, and then every other question in there, and I forget what the questions were, always no response, no response, no response, no response. So again, they weren't playing fair on both sides. But you look at what is really going on here. We as the church are saying that this is a human being. There was even someone talking about copywriting who the fetal tissue, copywriting the fetal tissue, and saying if you copyright it, then you can't destroy it. That's an interesting way to look at it. But saying each child has a unique set of chromosomes and values and everything else, and you can't just turn around and say they are a lifeless clump of tissues because they are more than that. And this is the whole reality. What we believe is this is a person from conception to natural birth. And this fight is continuing to this day. And I really think, and they've said this for decades, that this fight will ultimately divide the country. And I think it's happening right now. Especially since one party is the pro-abortion party and the other party is the anti-abortion party, and you have this big fight and you have this great division going on over that issue and others. And ultimately, it comes down to the difference over states' rights and federal rights. as far as the way the law comes down and the way it comes on a moral perspective is between the definition of what a human being is and the moral truth versus that which is not moral truth. So all of that is going on in all these arguments, and they all begin with our major division in the Constitution: states' rights versus federal rights, and then human rights versus, personal rights. So we're kind of looking at all of that. I didn't get to talk about the reading. We're going to have to go and talk about the reading on the other side of the break. You're listening to the Catholic Audio Media Podcast here on your favorite podcast platform. We'll be right back right after this. Did you know that the Catholic Audio Media Podcast is available on various podcast platforms? You can find us, among others, on Podbean, which is our home platform. You can find it on Spotify, Amazon Music, iHeart, among others. Just look for Catholic Audio Media, all one word. On some platforms, such as Spotify, look for Catholic Audio Media, 3 words, and subscribe and listen to the Catholic Audio Media Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Patreon. Patreon.com/Catholic Audio Media. Patreon.com/Catholic Audio Media. Check us out. Check what we have to offer. Previews of upcoming podcasts. Previews of upcoming columns over at catholicaudiomedia.substack.com. Your ability to comment, make suggestions, even make suggestions in upcoming programs. Check us out, patreon.com, Catholic Audio Media. We're back. So why don't we go over to the reading? This is from Samuel. And what we're looking at is this great jealousy that happens with Saul. Remember, Samuel is the prophet. Because what happens is David becomes this great soldier, and he becomes the star, and Saul gets upset about this. Now, maybe one of the things that's playing out is Saul also knows his days as a king are numbered. He doesn't necessarily know his days are numbered, but his days as a king are numbered. And so now he gets upset. He gets very jealous. Remember, Saul was very human. Well, so was David. But, we see Saul come out in a lot of his jealousy and other things. And he gets very jealous of David. So what happens with that is that Saul doesn't like what's going on with David. He doesn't like the way that this is happening. And so he gets jealous. And ultimately, Saul gets so jealous, he decides he wants to kill David. Now, there's another thing that's in here that is not in the reading from what I can tell. And let me just make sure of that. And that is that Saul is very upset with David. However, Saul's son and David are two of the most deepest friendships ever recorded in the Bible. As a matter of fact, there are people in the gay community use them as a sign of this reality of this love between two people of the same sex. Now, it's important to understand, and this is something that people don't understand, and that is, it doesn't necessarily mean that David and Jonathan were sexual partners. Or does it mean that if someone is necessarily gay, this is something that there are people that are trying to teach, does it mean that they are necessarily sexual partners with somebody else either? That's an important distinction. It's really important when we think of the story of Saul and David. David and Jonathan. Jonathan and David loved each other so much that, as we see in the Dewey Rems version, updated for the current English language, and that's me updating it. And it came to pass, when he had made an end of speaking to Saul, the son of Jonathan was knit with the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. And David and Jonathan made a covenant, for he loved him as his own soul. Saul, yeah, okay. Saul and Saul, yeah, blah, blah. And Jonathan stripped himself of the coat with which he was clothed and gave it to David, and the rest of his garments, even to his sword, and to his bow, and to his girdle. And David went out to whatsoever business Saul sent him, and he behaved himself prudently, and Saul sent him over the soldiers, and he was acceptable in the eyes of all the people, especially in the eyes of Saul's servants. Now, then the next scene is people are all celebrating David because he's such a hero, but they're not celebrating Saul as much. And that's one of the things that, Saul doesn't get. If you really think about it, you see, I went to see Marty Supreme the other night. And one of the reasons I went to see it was not only several recommendations, but also you may or may not know, well, you probably know that I'm a great fan of many of the shows, not all of them, many of the shows on WABC in New York. I don't necessarily agree with them per se. These are the WABC radio 77 on your AM dial. But there are many shows on WABC I like. Well, the owner of WABC stars in them is like he's a supporting role in the movie. And what happens is people will focus on the star, and the star will be the whole key of the movie, and everyone will celebrate and how wonderful they are. But the star is actually acting out the director's vision. The star gets all the glory. The director doesn't. And when the director gets that, it doesn't bother him at all. But in this case, you have Saul, who is the king, David, who is the hero, and he doesn't realize the praise of David is also praise of Saul, and he gets very upset. And that comes in after that scene. And so we see that aspect comes in. So Saul gets very jealous of David, and he decides he wants to kill David, which is really difficult for Jonathan because he loves David and he loves his father. And so you have this great struggle going on between Saul and David. But David recognizes Saul, although he knows the whole story. He knows that God has dismissed him as King Saul, dismissed Saul as king. He knows that God has anointed him to take his place. He knows all that. But at the same time, Saul is still the Lord's anointed. And this is an important consideration. Saul is still the Lord's anointed. And this is what happens. And with Saul being the Lord's anointed, David refuses to look upon Saul as his enemy, even though Saul looks upon David as his enemy. So there comes a point where Saul is sleeping and David comes upon him and realizes, and one of David's men says, "This is it. The Lord has given your enemy over to you." And David says, "No, I will not take my hand up against the Lord's anointed, period." That's it. And what he does is he shows by taking Saul's spear, and I think he also took a jug of water, and walks away or runs away with it, actually. And Saul wakes up. Saul was sleeping. Saul wakes up, and David's holding the spear, and he says to Saul, yells out to Saul, because there's a big chasm between them, "Now do you understand? I could have dispatched you if I really wanted to, but I chose not to, because David recognizes that Saul is the Lord's anointed." That continues to be David's policy until the death of Saul. So we're going to see a little bit of that tomorrow, which kind of continues the narrative of today. But what we're going to do is Saturday is when this policy really comes through, and another policy that David has comes through. And so therefore, since I'm not going to be talking about the readings on Saturday. We have a special program on Saturday, another Catholic Audio Media Weekend, very special program. We'll look at that on Saturday. But what I can tell you is Saul and Jonathan end up in a battle. If you've followed me along 2 years ago, then you know what I'm going to say. They end up in a battle, and they're fighting the Amalekites. Remember, what's the whole point of the Amalekites? The Amalekites want one thing: the total destruction of Israel and the total destruction of the Jews. That's what they want. And the Lord wanted the Amalekites destroyed because he knows they want nothing more and nothing less than the total destruction of the Jews and Israel. So, that said, we have this battle with the Amalekites, and Saul is mortally wounded, or severely wounded, but doesn't die yet. He's mortally wounded. He will die, but he doesn't die. And what essentially happens is he basically falls on his sword, but that doesn't kill him. And Jonathan, of course, is dead. And so with him falling on his sword, there's an Amalekite there, and the Amalekite begs, or Saul begs the Amalekite to kill him because the pain is intense. And the Amalekite does kill him, and then he runs as a messenger to tell David. And there we will learn that another one of David's policies as king is kill the messenger. It's one of the things he did. You never wanted to give David bad news. And sometimes you might think it's good news, and David would consider it bad news, and he would kill the messenger. So you never wanted to give David bad news. So the Amalekite doesn't know that, and he runs to tell David that Saul is dead, and he tells him how. He says, Saul begged me to kill him, and therefore I did. And David responds, you, by your own words, you condemn yourself, because you yourself said that you dispatched the Lord's anointed. And there you go. That's David's policy. You do not harm the Lord's anointed. And this is something a lot of people who hate our Pope, who hated Francis, who hate other popes, they don't get that, and they don't understand this real message in the Old Testament. You do not turn against the Lord's anointed. We'll be right back right after this. Snakes, zombies, sharks, heights, speaking in public. The list of fears is endless. But while you're clutching your blanket in the dark, wondering if the sound in the hall was actually a footstep, the real danger is in your hand when you're behind the wheel. And while you might think a great white shark is scary, what's really terrifying and even deadly is distracted driving. Eyes forward. Don't drive distracted. Brought to you by NHTSA and the Ad Council. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Patreon. Patreon.com/Catholic Audio Media. Patreon.com/Catholic Audio Media. Check us out. Check what we have to offer. Previews of upcoming podcasts. Previews of upcoming columns over at catholicaudiomedia.substack.com. Your ability to comment, make suggestions, even make suggestions in upcoming programs. Check us out. Patreon.com, Catholic Audio Media. We're back. So tomorrow we're going to talk a little bit more. I kind of got ahead of myself, but I told you a little what Saturday's reading is. But tomorrow we're going to talk a little bit more about this whole dissension between Saul and David and see where else that leads us as well. And of course, coming up this weekend, if everything goes as scheduled, I have an interview on a special offer. No, I'm not giving the offer here because it's not going to be official until May, and I'm not connected to it. I'm just interviewing the person who's connecting it. A discussion about coffee you can buy and in the process support homeless veterans. So we're going to be talking about that on Saturday. In the meantime, we are here, remember, every Monday through Friday at, it drops at midnight. The radio show used to come out at 3 o'clock in the morning and then 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So I keep having the habit of saying that. But no, drops at midnight. And so tomorrow's show will again drop at midnight as well. Here on your favorite podcast platform. Subscribe I love the likes. Thank you for the likes. Send me more likes. And also comment and everything else. And don't forget, CatholicAudiomedia.com is our website for the podcast. CatholicAudiomedia.substack.com is our website for our Substack. And in the meantime, don't forget, you can contact me at producer@CatholicAudiomedia.com. Have a blessed day. The Catholic teaching in this podcast is reflected and presented as accurately as possible. The opinions expressed are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the Archdiocese of Boston or any other institution.